Good afternoon. I'd like to begin with one quick anecdote. While I was working in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, we used to get a lot of letters that were addressed to the President of the United States as well as to our office. And one of the letters, and we always had to answer them, no matter how important or not important they were. That was a policy. You never ignore what an American citizen writes to you. And one of the questions was, why is it that this government is blocking marijuana research when marijuana has such potential as a medicine? And the office came to me and said, we don't know how to answer this. Can you help us? And I said, sure. We always had a staff who would write the responses. I said, but here's what you do. You go into the CRISP database, which is also known as Reporter now, of what research is supported by the National Institute of Health. And you put in the key terms, marijuana, cannabis, and there were 236 research grants issued in that year alone. So the myth that somehow the federal government was blocking research was demystified in one key press, and the staffer was amazed and took the data and wrote a very nice response letter. Marijuana as medicine. The ancient Greeks had a very interesting term called pharmakon, in which this term could mean a poison or it could mean a medicine. And in so many ways we are currently debating in which side of the scale does marijuana weigh. The world use of marijuana, as we've heard for this morning and throughout the session, is very high, with over 100 million people who are current users, with both the developing and the developed world as heavy users, North America, Europe, as well as parts of Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of the Middle East. In 1938, Professor Walton of the Medical College of South Carolina stated, 1938, the therapeutic application of cannabis is more history than present-day practice. Synthetic analgesics, painkillers, and hypnotics have almost entirely displaced these preparations from their original field. The newer synthetics are more effective and reliable. The drug has certain remarkable properties, and if its chemical structure were determined and synthetic variations developed, some of these might be particularly valuable as therapeutic agents and as experimental tools. That was 1938. What happened since that time? So we're going to very quickly look at the history of plant products as medicines, marijuana history and its mechanisms, the Food and Drug Administration approval process for drugs, for medicines, the ruling on marijuana as a medicine, the ballot initiatives, referenda, very quickly, why is marijuana a medical disaster, and the future of cannabinoids. The history of plant products as medicines. The majority of our pharmaceuticals originally were derived from plants, because plants gave us the best clues. We have digitalis from foxglove, we have atropine from the belladonna plant, we have aspirin from the willow tree, we have quinine, which is a very potent anti-malarial drug, from a different tree. What is interesting, during this early period of medicines, which has spanned thousands of years of human history, is that the composition of the medicinal compound was unknown and unregulated. They were treating the symptoms and not illnesses. The pathology, the underlying disease, was unknown. There was a poor understanding of how these drugs work, and the quantities were inconsistent and unregulated. In the 19th century and continuing on to the 20th and 21st century, the active chemicals were isolated from plants, digitalis, atropine, acetylsalicylic acid, aspirin, as well as quinine. They were isolated from the plants, and then they became highly purified and defined to treat specific illnesses, knowing how they work, and they were administered in controlled, consistent doses. And this is a standard that was measured, and this is the standard that has been applied now for the past century. The history of marijuana itself goes back over 5,000 years. The Peng Tao Ching Pharmacopoeia mentions it in 2727 BC, describing the medicinal properties of marijuana as well as its psychiatric side effects. In 1200 BC, up to 1894 in AD in India, there was marijuana was one of 5 sacred plants, and then the British issued a report on Indian hemp drugs through a commission. In 400 AD, a 14-year-old girl died in childbirth. Obviously, it was due to a breech delivery, which she was unable to deliver. And the ashes, she was found by an archaeologist, and the ashes were found beside her nose. And during that period of time, there's a little ant crawling on my screen. So that's an unwanted invader. During that time, a very well-known chemist, a marijuana medicinal chemist, was called to the scene. And he was given access to the ashes. He analyzed them, and it turned out to be delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol in the ashes, because they suspected that she'd been treated with marijuana smoke in order to relieve the pain of childbirth. Between 1928 and 1942, the United Kingdom and the United States began to regulate marijuana. The recreational use of marijuana was banned in the UK. Marijuana tax in the US in the 1930s essentially prohibited marijuana use. And in 1942, marijuana was removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia, which describes and defines legitimate medications. And then in 1961, 60 nations signed the Uniform Drug Convention, which pledged to end marijuana use within 25 years. In 1976, the Netherlands separated marijuana from hard drugs on the basis of a number of factors which we can describe later or not at all. And the sale of marijuana was tolerated. And then in the 1980 Marinol, the active ingredient of marijuana, THC, was approved for oral administration for nausea in cancer patients, and 12 years later, it was approved for treatment of anorexia in AIDS. Similar to other specific plants, marijuana has had a long history in medicine. It resembles the cannabinoids produced in the brain. These cannabinoids are produced in the brain and the body. The cannabinoid signaling system has multiple functions in learning and memory and inflammation and pregnancy. So there is, as with so many drugs that are plant-derived, there are specific targets in the brain and the body because these plants produce chemicals that resemble the chemicals that our body produces. The real big and important difference is that a tiny change in a chemical can make an enormous, enormous difference in terms of its biological effects. I can add one carbon onto a molecule and convert it from an innocent product of the brain into an addictive drug. Phenethylamine is innocent, made by the brain. You add a carbon and you get amphetamine, which is highly addictive. Add a second carbon, you get methamphetamine, which is highly addictive. So the chemistry of these plant products is not benign. These compounds are different than what the brain produces. In some cases, they have therapeutic benefit. In other cases, they have high abuse and addictive potential. And we've already seen the slide showing that the cannabinoid system in the brain is involved with memory, motor coordination, with hormone release, with pain perception, with a number of very critical functions. There are two different signaling systems for cannabinoids in the brain and body. One of them, called the CB1, responds to marijuana, and that's involved with appetite, pain, coordination, hormone production, learning, memory, addiction to not only marijuana but opioids in the placenta and the uterus. It regulates pregnancy, fertility, implantation, and in skeletal nerve terminals. The CB2 system, the cannabinoid 2 system, does not at all respond to marijuana. Marijuana does not fit that target as well as it fits the CB1. And the reason I say this is I'm projecting towards near the end of the talk, where I say there are strategies for completely disarming the medical marijuana story. Neurogenesis, that means the production of new nerve cells, the immune system, inflammatory response, and pain. Functions in the intestinal tract, the liver, the cardiovascular system, lung, airways. All of these have cannabinoid receptors that do not respond to marijuana. Think about the implications of that for one moment. There are many, many cannabinoid effects, some positive, some negative, some both. I won't get into it because we don't have time, but they are points for discussion. The real question is, why is marijuana, smoke marijuana, a concern? If you smoke marijuana or you give it intravenously, in both methods of delivery, you get a high. And these are not very high concentrations. These are normal subjects, and what you see is a very profound high, whereas the oral dose, which is the green triangles, you get a very moderated response that is not acute, it's not rapid onset, and it wanes over time. And it's for this reason that THC, in many ways, was far more acceptable as an approved drug, Marinol, for nausea as well as for AIDS wasting, because it had far reduced psychoactive effects. And when in one of the testimonies against a medical marijuana bill in the state of Maryland, one person stood up and said, well, if you don't want the smoke of marijuana, we can always bake it into brownies. And I said, if you're going to bake it into brownies, why not use Marinol, an approved drug? So, the real issue is, the first question we ask in terms of concerns is, can the therapeutic benefit be distinguished from euphoria? Is marijuana a mask of a therapeutic response? The second question is, why is marijuana a concern? The acute effects of marijuana are significant. Mood is elevated, increased laughter, improved hearing, enhanced sensory input, euphoria, hunger, relaxation. All of these things are well documented. But there's a shopping list of adverse consequences acutely. Impaired memory, impaired motor coordination, impaired cognition, impaired attention, impaired time sense, impaired self-perception, impaired ability to perform complex tasks, impaired sleep, impaired balance, disjointed thoughts, anxiety, and dizziness. All of these are also part of the spectrum of acute effects. And why is marijuana concerned? There are other acute effects. High doses can give you hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, confusion, anxiety. It can increase heart rate, increase blood pressure lying down, or reduce blood pressure standing. Why is marijuana a concern? Because long-term marijuana use can affect brain health and function. It can lead to abuse and addiction. The addiction potential is between 9 and 10% of people who use for so-called non-medical or even medical purposes. We don't even know. But the addiction rate is rising even though the number of people using has not changed significantly between the early 1990s and 2000s. And the reason it is rising in that period of that time is possibly because the concentration of THC in the plant was increasing. It's associated with an increased risk of psychosis and possibly schizophrenia, associated with increased risk of depression. We heard that in yesterday's session. An early onset of use is associated with cognitive impairment later on in life. And there are so many brain imaging studies, I'm not going to describe them because I want to get to the heart of this issue. And there are other concerns, physical concerns, bronchitis, compromised pulmonary function, changes in cells in the lung, cardiovascular effects, pregnancy, birth defects, and hormonal problems with marijuana. Why is marijuana a concern? Because of addiction. Progression to chronic use is as rapid as nicotine. It's more rapid than alcohol, and tolerance and withdrawal may reflect a severe addiction. And one can have withdrawal. These have been well documented in the literature. Why is marijuana a concern? We heard this yesterday. This is the odds ratio. If the ratio is 1, it means there's no great risk. If the ratio exceeds 1, 1.5, 2, 2.53, it means you have a higher risk for developing a psychosis. And studies done throughout these countries have all documented the increased risk for psychosis with prior use of marijuana. Why is marijuana a concern? It's a concern because marijuana impairs cognitive function. I won't get into the details of the slide, but what you can see is immediate recall is impaired. It's much more impaired in schizophrenics than in normals. The FDA approval process and the FDA ruling on marijuana, this is an important one to study because this is the heart of the controversy. How do drugs get approved in the United States? The FDA is the sole federal agency that approves drugs as safe and effective for intended indications. It requires controlled research, clinical trials to base approval on safety, efficacy, and labeling decisions. And it requires new drugs to be shown that they are safe and effective for their intended use, and to bypass the FDA drug approval process exposes patients to unsafe and ineffective products. We had this in the 1970s when, especially driven by someone who owned a patent on Laetrile, and a few other cancer patients wanted this product from apricot pits to be approved for cancer therapy. And they went through state legislatures, through state referenda, through a variety of mechanisms until more than 20 states had approved it, until the National Cancer Institute finally got involved in 3 ways. First, they looked at the literature, then they requested information from physicians. They wrote letters to 300,000 physicians in the US. They knew that 70,000 people had been treated with it, and they wanted the physicians' data on it. They got 90 cases back from 300,000 doctors and 70,000 patients. And of those 90, a few people seemed to have been benefited, so they then did clinical trials. They sponsored them and found that it was completely ineffective, Laetrile. Not only was it ineffective, but it was dangerous because part of the molecule had a cyanide component, and 1 or 2 people, in fact, were poisoned by it. That is why the FDA is so important in this. What is the approval process like? It is daunting. I know personally, because we have an invention that's up for FDA approval now that has been sitting with the FDA for years and years and years, and the patent has run out, and that's fine with me. I would prefer them to be cautious rather than to be reckless. I could never live with my conscience if something was approved and then found to be harmful to patients. It takes 3 years to do lab testing, 1 year to do the phase 1 on 0 to 80 healthy volunteers. It then takes another 2 years to do a phase 2 on 100 to 300 patients to measure the drug's effectiveness. It takes 3 more years to do a phase 3 in which you use 1,000 to 3,000 patients to determine effectiveness. Then it takes 2.5 more years to develop the application and get it approved. Many applications to the FDA are 100,000 pages of documentation. 100,000 pages. And if approved, there's an ongoing requirement to report cases of adverse reactions and other clinical data. The FDA criteria are rational and scientifically based. The chemistry has to be known. The manufacturing process has to be absolutely spelled out in every detail. How many volumes of this chemical and this, and is the composition of matter 100% pure or 99% pure? And what are those impurities? You have to validate that the production can be repeated over and over and you get the identical compound. You have to do pharmacology and toxicology tests. You have to know how the drug gets into the system, where it goes, how much gets in, whether or not it's contaminated with microbes, what dose is going to be effective, and what is the safety range of the dose, and is it effective? What about side effects? How many are there, and are these side effects acceptable or unacceptable? And then you have to continue doing safety cases. So let's look at the first criteria: pure compound, reproducible concentrations. This is the analysis of marijuana smoke. Smoke the way a marijuana person would smoke it compared to tobacco. If you look at the data, hydrogen cyanide is much, much more concentrated in the marijuana smoke than it is in a cigarette. These are carcinogens. If you look at these data, you see the same for benzene, toluene, styrene. If you look at these data, you see that tobacco and marijuana smoke, in fact, have almost the same concentrations of substances that are considered toxic. Marijuana is not a pure product. It's this ammonia in marijuana smoke is up to 20 times greater than tobacco smoke. It has hydrogen cyanide, nitrous oxide, other nitrous oxides and aromatics that are found. The amount that gets, delivered varies. The amount in the marijuana plant that is sold varies from 0.5 to 15%, 10-fold differences that are not controlled. The delivery can be 5 times more efficient or less efficient. So that smoked marijuana does not fulfill the FDA requirements for dose. It's not standardized, there's no quality control, it's not regulated. The smoked, the vaporized, the baked products all vary. And what about the clinical trials? What have we seen with clinical trials? Here's where we have to look very carefully. Look at the number of patients, 30. Greater than 700 with mixed results. Sativex has controlled doses. Smoke, 1 is 10. 1 patient, 10 patients. THC, a pure ingredient, greater than 52. If you look at the clinical trials for pain, you see that the number of patients, 44 or 10. And if you go through all the literature, one by one, what you see is that so many clinical trials use tiny numbers of patients, and in many cases they use pure ingredients, and yet the marijuana lobby conflates the two. It claims that marijuana is effective when they use THC, or they use nabilone, or they use a CB1 antagonist or rimonabant. They use a mixture of different types of cannabinoids, and they conflate the data. So, I'm going to wrap up as quickly as I can. The Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research was signed by Gray Davis, the governor of California, in 1999, to try to understand at a scientific level what are the medical indications for marijuana. 36 scientific reports were issued since then, less 12 that are abstracts that are not really peer-reviewed. 5 clinical studies were discontinued. There's only 4 out of this huge amount of millions and millions of dollars that were performed with patients according to ballot initiatives. And just very quickly, one person who did, I think, a very careful study showed that patients were, above all, they were experienced marijuana users. They did not recruit the ordinary public. They showed pain reduction, but they said they were feeling high, they were impaired, they were sedated, their cognition was impaired. This just came out. The side effect profile was quite high. Discontinued because they couldn't recruit enough patients. For spasticity, discontinued, they couldn't find enough patients. For HIV-associated neuropathic pain, discontinued, they couldn't find enough people. For chemotherapy-induced delayed nausea, discontinued, they couldn't find enough people. For analgesic effects in refractory cancer pain, discontinued, they couldn't find enough people. So, this is the issue. The FDA ruled that marijuana does not fulfill FDA criteria. I won't give you the entire read of this. Computer's stuck. Give me one more minute. Just I just want to close with a final. The FDA has ruled that there's no reason to approve marijuana because the evidence for safety and efficacy does not subject it. We get ballot initiatives where a whole shopping list of conditions are approved by non-expert people, for migraine, for Alzheimer's, for Crohn's disease, a whole shopping list of things that make no sense because there's no literature. A shopping list amongst these states for different concentrations you can have or grow. And the use of it is simply not justifiable. So I call marijuana as medicine a medical disaster for a number of reasons. It's a medical disaster. I've already given the reasons. The future of this is in pure products. And I'd like to just close with this lesson. Morphine is isolated from the opium plant. If it's changed into a different version, it becomes heroin, which can be injected and is highly addictive. Cocaine was isolated from the coca plant, and it was converted to xylocaine and procaine, local anesthetics, because the chemists looked at the structure of cocaine, figured out which part of the molecule confers addiction, and they were able to change it. And this is why I think it is poor public policy in medical practice to permit marijuana to be used as a smoke medicine. It's not FDA approved, ingested by smoking, hundreds of chemicals, not subject to product liability, exempt from quality control, provided at unknown strengths, not governed by dose, frequency, longitudinal effects. It's self-prescribed and self-administered. It is poor medical practice to use smoke medicine if Marinol is approved. The intoxicating effects are not acceptable. The scientific evidence does not achieve FDA standards, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you.